Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. Welcome everyone to our second session of the dialogue on evidence and experience, Adolescent Girls Education in the Generation Equality Forum. My name is Zara El Hilali, and today I'm joining you all the way from the land down under, Australia, moderating today's session. We are so excited to have you here today for the second session. And I can definitely tell you all that we have a lineup filled with amazing and incredible speakers that I am so excited to present to you today. Now, before we begin, I just want to respectfully acknowledge that today I will be facilitating on the Indigenous land of Australia, held by Indigenous Aboriginal people. It is super important to recognise that Indigenous women are also one of the constituencies that are also left behind within the discussion for gender equality. So it is super important for me to begin on that note. Now, before we begin an incredible session today, I just want to first of all preface a bit of housekeeping rules. Interpretation is available on Zoom on your right-hand corner. As well as that, the chat box will be open where you will be able to comment all your thoughts, all your questions, anything that you have to say throughout the webinar. So please feel free to actively use this feature throughout the day. We will also be having a couple of polls available. And to hit it off on that note, why don't we open up our first poll? The first poll for today is, has your knowledge of generation equality evolved within the first dialogue held on February the 11th? Please feel free to answer whilst we head on during the day. Now, to give you a quick recap about the first session that was held on February 11th, it was organised by UN Women France, Ireland in partnership with UNESCO, Plan International, GPE and the Malala Fund. This event brings together Action Coalition leaders, policymakers, civil society representatives, and youth leaders and activists from across the world to highlight the role of education as a catalyst for gender equality, but also as a cross-cutting strategy to achieve the goals of the Generation Equality Forum Action Coalitions. The purpose of these dialogues is to provide a space for adolescent girls and young women to share with experts and professionals their challenges, needs, and experiences in taking action to advance the education of adolescent girls and provide recommendations to reflect adolescent girls' needs in the Action Coalition blueprint. In the first dialogue held on February 11th, we heard from tremendous speakers on how to integrate adolescent girls' education in the action coalitions on feminist movements and leadership, bodily autonomy, and SRHR, and technology and innovation. We heard the need to create spaces for girls with more and better funding to meet girls' needs on the ground. We heard the need to establish enabling political environments for girls to both learn and lead, and the importance of role models. We heard the need for transformative learning environments stemming from the context of every different community in this regard. We heard a powerful presentation on the challenges lived by Indigenous girls. Girls' education is not only critical to tackling the root causes of inequality in women's work and economic empowerment. It is a human right and a necessary precondition to ensure skills and knowledge for women and girls, deeper understanding of their rights and agency for mobilizing social change and progress. It is one of the most powerful tools to achieve gender equality. Now, to kick off today's event, it is my absolute privilege to introduce the first speaker, the incredible permanent representative of Ireland to the United Nations, Ambassador Geraldine Bryant-Mason. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed for that introduction, Zara, and for getting us off to a very lively start for this second dialogue. It's good to see you all on the screen today, our second set of dialogues on adolescent girls education in generation equality. Last Thursday, as you said, Dara, we had a really rich and inspiring series of dialogues, exchanges on 3 of the Action Coalition themes. And I thought just briefly now in the introductory remarks, I'd highlight what we think are a few of the key points that arose, because when I spoke to you last Thursday, one of the things I said was that we weren't all here to talk at each other. We were here definitely to listen to the views of girls. And so I just wanted to highlight what we took away from that. I think that we heard speakers both from panels and the audience, which was good that there was a coming together of views, emphasizing one fundamental thing, perhaps above all else, and that is that education is a right of all girls. We heard that education should be one that prepares girls to be active and powerful participants in society. It has that overriding objective. We heard that we need to aim to create an enabling political environment for girls and young women to learn and to lead. We want to see that educational services deliver. They really must deliver for what we would say the objective needs of girls on the ground. And we also heard of the real need to overcome the negative social norms that limit women's participation in public life, and also keep adolescent girls out of school, which is of course a major preoccupation. Chanceline from Mevowanu, if I pronounced that correctly, made the point that girls are not born less ambitious or with less self-esteem than boys. The gaps widen, and we see that the gaps widen over time because of their environment, the messages they grow up with, and how their education shapes or indeed doesn't shape them. We can change this. We don't need to accept this as some kind of a fact of life. Gender transformative education can empower girls and young women to realize their full potential. And Dara, you referred to where you're transmitting your messages to us today from an Indigenous land, sacred land. And we know that Indigenous women and girls face particular challenges that often go unseen or worse, are discounted. So Adriana from UX highlighted the importance of context and the need to work within and value Indigenous culture, practices and knowledge. Sexual and reproductive health and rights are a foundation for political engagement. We heard that. Kavita of Ramdas put it in this way: we need to have power over our bodies, to have power over the body politic. Age and gender responsive, comprehensive sexuality education should be accessible for all children, adolescents and young people in and out of school. And this is essential to achieve sexual and reproductive health, well-being and bodily autonomy that we know. Chanceline of Mevowanu and Agat, who came from Blanket Kamisoko, both highlighted the potential for using digital spaces and social media to engage girls and women in feminist dialogue and action. Now, as we went on with the dialogue, many of the audience comments pointed to the gender digital divide and the impact this is having on girls' education during the COVID-19 pandemic. Ebru from Bakalugo, Tuzakan, and Celine of Uzundalim, and I really apologize for those pronunciations, they noted the regression in the gender digital divide, and that for girls, the biggest loss of interest in STEM occurs between the ages of 13 and 17, which is of course a critical window when that whole digital access comes really into play as a factor. Technology can be a powerful tool for advancing gender equality, but we need to overcome the stereotype that says computers are for boys. We need to provide equal access to the internet and to devices, basic devices for girls, while of course also addressing the pervasiveness of what we know is gender-based violence on digital and social media networks. So friends, last week, as I said at the beginning, we heard great interventions, lots of passion, lots of energy from many young women who shared both their personal stories as well as their visions, who presented very concrete, tangible solutions, and above all, who demanded change. So today I'm looking forward to being inspired by more young voices and to learning how collectively, all of us working together, we can create an equal and a better future for all adolescent girls. So back to you, Zara. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Geraldine, for your heartfelt words. I can definitely share your sentiments, and I'm sure that your sentiments are shared by so many people across the world. Before I do head on into the next speaker, I will just quickly introduce the poll that I did mention earlier. Now, the poll that we have decided to commence with today is, has your knowledge of generation equality evolved with the first dialogue held on February the 11th? That should be available on your screen now, and we would love to hear your answers. Now, whilst we are all waiting, it is now my greatest delight to introduce the next speaker of today. Now, this speaker I have had the privilege of working with, and I can definitely tell you that she is a fierce force within the space of feminism. She is the co-founder of Young Feminist Europe, member of the CSAG, and co-leader of the Action Coalition on Feminist Movements and Leadership. Please welcome Xenia Kellner.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. Unfortunately, I do have some connection issues today, but I hope it will last for this short introduction or intervention. I'm super excited to be here today and discussing with you this important topic on adolescent girl education and the Generation Equality Forum. Education as a very important factor for transformation, individual transformation. And this is what the Generation Equality Forum is about and focusing. How do we transform and accelerate the 2030 agenda to achieve gender equality and intersectional justice? So from a young feminist perspective, the element of intersectionality also in girls' education is a very key issue, and I'm very happy to have already heard quite a bit of input from the last session on this and the summary of that, talking about whose knowledge is important and is relevant. Before we start, and I'm very excited to hear all the speakers today and how this topic is important and relevant for the action coalitions that we will be discussing today. I just want to encourage, or maybe I'm coming with a few questions, because something that as young feminists and adolescent girls have heavily discussed in the Generation Equality Forum is also, is education something that is just for adolescent girls and young feminists, and who decides what is important? Or is it something, if we talk about transformation, that is important throughout the whole process? Is it in the Generation Equality Forum process important to build capacities, and who learns from who? What knowledge do adolescent girls and young feminists also have to offer to the Generation Equality Forum and the action coalitions? The transformative force that young feminists and adolescent girls bring into the space, and the innovation. What is it, maybe for today's discussion as well, what is it to ensure that we achieve this transformative goal? What do we need to unlearn about international advocacy spaces? What is it that we need to unlearn about current practices, about who is organizing events, and how can we ensure that the outcomes of this event today are a relevant part in the forums of Mexico and France, but not just as something that we discuss, but how do we really create a transformative space where we co-create something with young feminists and adolescent girls? I am looking forward to hearing the recommendations for the action coalitions today, and I wish everyone a lot of exciting conversations. And I'm giving the word to whom? Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much for your words, Zinnia. It is our greatest pleasure to have you on board here today. Now, before we dive into our next question of the day, I just wanted to quickly share the results of the previous poll that we had. Now, the question that was raised was, has your knowledge about generation equality increased since the first dialogue? And as Ambassador Geraldine mentioned earlier, education is a powerful tool that will create change. And 86% of participants voted yes. So we can definitely tell that education, especially for young girls and women, is definitely a major factor to creating intergenerational reform. Now, the next question of the day, which I'd all love for you to participate within the chat function, is what is one insight that you hope to take away after this webinar series concludes? We'd love to hear your thoughts, and we'd love to share these answers throughout the day. Now, as you're all typing into the chat function, I'll just quickly introduce today's agenda for the day. We definitely have a fierce and absolutely incredible lineup of speakers and sessions, and I am so excited, as I hope all of you are. The first session today will be economic justice and rights with 3 incredible leaders from across the world. The second session will be gender-based violence. The third session will be feminist action for climate justice, and we will end off with conclusions from Alice Albright, CEO of the Global Partnership for Education, and Ambassador Delphine O. I'm so excited for today, and I really do hope you are. Please continue to use the chat function as we progress throughout the day, because we'd love to call upon your comments and questions. But now we head on into the first session of the day, economic justice and rights. With today's session, we have 3 incredible speakers, Namla Nikki, Rasha Hafar, and Huma Zia. Now, during this session, please feel free to utilize the chat function to ask questions and comments, and we will have a short little Q&A session at the end of the panel if time permits. But now we head on into the first session, and I'm so excited to introduce Namla Nikki, co-leader of the Action Coalition, senior executive and specialist, the presidency of the Republic of South Africa, to share an update on the draft of the Action Coalition blueprint and how it has integrated the topic of education thus far. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Zara, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone that's online. Such a pleasure to join such an important conversation. As has been said, I represent South Africa in the Action Coalition on Economic Justice and Rights. And we are right in the middle of, so there's a number of colleagues that lead that Action Coalition, from business to civil society to member states. And we're right in the middle of just working out our blueprint, particularly determining what key tactics and actions we want to take in order to promote inclusive economies, transformed economies across the globe. We've identified 4 themes that belong to or belong under economic justice and rights. One is transformed care economies. Second is to ensure decent work and employment in the formal and informal economy. Third is access to, control over, and ownership of productive resources. And fourth is to engender national economic reforms and stimulus packages. One of the challenges that you get when you are having to zoom in on this topic of adolescent girls and education in as far as economic justice and rights is concerned is that you have to layer all of these key variables. And one of the things that we decided to do was to ensure that we're not just dealing with things that have to do with education directly, but also those other factors, particularly economic factors, that may either be a hindrance or an enabler to adolescent girls' education, as it were. I'm going to try and highlight a few of those because I don't have a lot of time in this introductory remark, but so a couple of examples. Under transformed care economies, one of the key things that's emerging, I think, is around time use, particularly the distribution of domestic work between boys and girls. We know that a lot of the times the unfair distribution of domestic work towards girls prevents them from actually accessing education, as it were. So one of the strong statements we are saying there is we are calling for the implementation of programs that seek to distribute unpaid care and domestic work within households. But that also has to do with mind frames or mental shifts and cultural biases that need to be destroyed, as it were, in order for girls to actually have fair responsibilities within their home. Then the second one is around access to, control over, and ownership of productive resources, which is our second sub-theme. And here, interestingly, over and above recognizing education as a human right, we've actually tabled education as a productive resource, because we are defining productive resources as those resources that enable one in the present or in the future to actually eke out a livelihood, as it were. And so inheritance laws generally here tend to be a major hindrance, and we are highlighting that, but also other productive resources such as digital IDs, for instance, which enable young girls to access education, but also to access other social services. We are calling out for the rollout of those, as well as access to technology. Maybe just as I conclude, one last example I want to make is around this third sub-theme, which is to engender national economic reforms and stimulus packages. This is a big one because this has to do with really radically transforming how planning is made and how financing decisions are made, how budgeting is made. And overall, what we're calling for here is a gender responsive budgeting and planning framework across the globe. But in relation to that specifically, we are calling for financing to improve human capital development, including education, but also including health, protection, social services, and those kinds of things. And then, of course, voice under decent work and employment is an important one, but also protecting girls from unfair labor practices that increase their vulnerability is something that we are highlighting. But having said all of that, Madam Chair, I think the main thing here for me is to come and to listen in and to hear what the key issues that you think we are missing as gaps that I can take back to my colleagues within the Action Coalition. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much for your incredible words. I totally share your sentiments whereby we have to radicalize the budget and apply a gender-based budget. And I definitely do recognize that I don't think one country has yet to do so, to apply a gender-based budget, especially during the time of COVID-19. I'd now like to move to Rasha Hafar, Young Activists co-founder and CEO of Youth Activist Slavery Movement, to share her thoughts and experiences about the priorities and initiatives that have proven to work to address these priorities that we've previously discussed. Rasha, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Zahra. Hello, everyone. Wherever you are, it's nice to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation. So I want to just emphasize on what Namla just said, the importance of fair labor and these practices that can make girls avoid being vulnerable is very important. And actually, I will dig a little bit more deeper into that. So when we talk about the intersection between economic justice and rights, focusing on the care economy and decent work, these are the two themes I will focus on. We need to talk about trafficking in women and girls and modern slavery. So let me tell you a story of Maryam. Maryam is a 9-year-old girl from Tunisia who lives in a remote village 3 hours outside of the capital, Tunis. Maryam's father, at a point in his life, found himself at a crossroad. He had both his kids in school, Maryam and her brother, and he no longer could afford education for both. So he had to make a choice. Was he going to be dropping out the girl or the boy? Of course, you know it. He was going to drop the girl out of school. And why is that? Well, because Maryam can actually easily be sold into being a domestic slave in one of the rich family's houses, where she could start working and getting income for the family to support her brother's education. And then the boy is supposed to be growing older to become the household man who's going to take care of the family. So the father didn't hesitate to drop her out. And then we can see that that's something that happens all around the world, especially also in Africa, because family ties are very strong. And some young women may also be compelled to migrate to enable their male siblings to complete their education. And these women could face a lot of risks that could make them fall into trafficking and debt bondage when they seek assistance to access employment, work permits, visas, etc. So did you know that 1 in 130 women and girls globally are victims of modern slavery, with figures expected to actually rise due to COVID-19? Modern slavery is an umbrella term that covers a range of exploitative practices, including human trafficking, slavery, forced labor, child labor, removal of organs, and slavery-like practices. And did you know that almost 29 million women and girls are victims of modern slavery, which means that there are millions others like Miriam. And females account for 99% of victims of forced sexual exploitation, 84% of all victims of forced marriage, and 58% of victims of forced labor, according to Work Free's report. So what is important here today is that we need to create that intersectional approach into deconstructing how these root causes are leading up to those practices. And those root causes are in the heart of education. So education is crucial to prevent girls from falling into these practices and from falling into vulnerable situations where they do not have access to proper work, fair work, decent work. So when we, for example, talk about unpaid domestic work or care work, some governments actually depend on women and girls' unpaid work or unpaid domestic workers to deliver and even replace public services as they seek to limit the financial burden on the state. And then by that, they enforce the culture that to neglect education and instead have girls stay at home and do the care work. Other governments also don't have in place policies and mechanisms to ensure that girls not only have access to school, but also they should not drop out and they should remain in schools. And even if some countries have those policies in place, they're not reinforced. And we see that in the example of Tunisia. For example, in Tunisia, it's illegal for parents to drop their kids out of school. However, it's happening, and no one is implementing the law, because we go back to the root causes of poverty. We go back to how are these families going to survive. So therefore, the government doesn't actually take any response towards that. So the lack of quality education is an important factor for explaining how girls end up being trafficked. A recent study from Nepal found that lack of education options is a key driver for trafficking of girls. And a similar study from Cambodia found that survivors of trafficking had a lower level of education, which actually goes up to 83% of those interviewed in actually one of Plan International studies. And the highest level of education they had was primary level. So increasing access to education, to quality education, can play an important role in preventing trafficking. And therefore, we need governments to recognize in their policies the care sectors as legitimate areas of paid work by addressing gender segregated labor markets and human trafficking into the care economy. Solutions could be also as simple as eliminating obstacles that place demands on the child's family to provide items that prevent school attendance. For example, we have a story from Zambia where parents cannot sometimes afford buying a child closed-toe shoes and therefore decide to drop their kids out of school. So it's just these small obstacles that we can definitely work on eliminating. I want to also say that women form the majority of the unemployed force And that makes them face higher and higher percentages of exploitation, and they face more troubles in their life. So when we talk about transformation, we need to keep in mind and to keep up with the global trends. Human trafficking and modern slavery is an issue that keeps rising, and we still don't see it in any of our policies. So we need to keep up with the global trends that keep affecting the livelihoods of our girls and women. And therefore, education is super crucial for achieving SDG 8, which is the decent work. And that's why we need to ensure that technical and vocational education and training aims to reduce the number of unemployed youth by increasing access to training opportunities. And when we talk about education, we not only talk about access to education, we need to talk about the materials we're teaching. We need to talk about what are we teaching our kids. Isn't it important that when we have our children living in areas where trafficking is prevalent, isn't it important that the first thing we do is actually educate our girls on how to prevent themselves and how to protect themselves from falling into these crimes? I actually want to commend the work that Argentina has done. They have created this whole national plan where they introduced curricula and educational materials in school around decent work, where they were creating a culture to emphasize the importance of decent work to new generations. And they were teaching the kids what is decent work actually, and how can we get there through our education and collective work, and also by training teachers. So just to conclude, education is in the heart of everything. If we want our world to thrive, not just to survive, we need to ensure that education for girls is accessible and is something that they can survive, not only survive in, but thrive, and they can get the rights in life so that they can have a decent life afterwards and not be finding themselves in any vulnerable situations. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope this was beneficial.
Thank you so much, Rasha. I mean, we've heard the statistics, 1 in 136 women. We've heard the case studies from Nepal, but I think it's now up to government to actually put their money where their mouth is and implement the policies that young people have been asking for decades. We understand the issues, and it's now time to listen to young people and listen to what they have to say about this. Now, before I move on to the next speaker, I'd just like to remind everyone here today that if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat box. We will be having a Q&A session in a couple of moments, and we'd love to give you the opportunity to ask our amazing panelists any questions that you have. But now moving on to the next speaker, I'm so very delighted to introduce education expert Huma Zia, Programs Lead for PAC Alliance for Maths and Science Welfare Trust Pakistan, to react to the potential solutions identified by the speakers and outline how the GEF can respond to the challenges. Huma, please feel free to take the floor.
Thank you, Zara. I'd like to take a minute and thank the event organizers for inviting me here to speak at the panel. And I'd also like to thank Namla and my co-presenter Rasha for actually setting the stage for the conversation so well by highlighting the importance of youth voice in the process of collating action points for gender equality. It's truly a privilege and an honor to be sharing this space with incredible young women who drive us towards a more equal and a just future. I feel that when I share the experience of adolescent girls from Pakistan today on this forum, I am advocating on behalf of all young girls in developing countries facing similar multi-dimensional challenges in terms of access to their basic right to education. Speaking in context of Pakistan specifically, just in the last decade and a half, Pakistan's made significant strides in terms of improving girls' education. However, there are still 12 million girls who continue to remain out of school. For every 4 government primary schools in Pakistan, there's only 1 government post-primary school, which is often at a very long distance. And what happens is that as a result of the long distance, the girl child drops out of the school. For those girls who do make it to middle schools, insufficient government funding with respect to quality education yields low quality of learning outcomes, resulting in lack of skill development among children, and also resonating with the low retention rates in post-primary schools. One of the other prominent factors which serves as a challenge in Pakistan is that there's a significant shortage of female science teachers, or let's say STEM educators, which results in young girls not taking up science or STEM subjects as their area of learning post-primary education. And in return, in the long run, we see that this reflects in women and young girls being engaged in low-paying jobs and hence continuing to be underrepresented in the STEM fields. So challenges, education challenges across Pakistan and many of the developing countries sort of represent the same vast challenges and are often deep-rooted in social and cultural context. The COVID-19 pandemic has not only sort of accelerated this issue for girls, but it is multifold for girls who are harder to reach, for example, from poorer households and in rural communities. So the recommendations that I make today are for the national government, international organizations, UN organizations, and for donors to take into perspective and work on local context specific solutions. So the first and the foremost one being is to ensure safe and secure access to girls for post-primary schools as a basic right to education. The governments need to construct more post-primary schools for girls with a focus on local and customized retention models, which ensure that girls continue to learn and get education for at least 12 years of schooling. And in order to ensure that girls continue to attend school and quality of education is the key. So we need to make sure that our girls are, learning lifelong skills. They're getting equipped with 21st century skills, which actually essentially allows them access to better economic opportunity. Research shows that, STEM subjects play a very important role in developing cognitive and critical thinking skills among children. And it is all the more important to actually conduct a gender audit of the content that's being taught in STEM subjects to young students, girls and boys both. So what really happens is that in terms of textbooks and the content that is shared with young students at an early age, mostly we see that, women are shown as doing household chores or house-related or care-related work, whereas examples of most of the renowned scientists turn out to be men. Another very important recommendation that I want to make is the investment that needs to happen in terms of recruiting female STEM educators at all levels of education, which is primary, middle, and high. In order to ensure that we develop scientific inquiry and inquisitiveness among children from an early age, we need to have primary teachers who are science experts and who are able to communicate and sort of teach kids scientific concepts from a young age, so that when they go to post-primary schools to higher levels of education, they do not feel that they're lagging behind and then eventually drop out of school. The last recommendation that I'm going to make, which of course is also by far one of the most important ones, is that without increased financial allocation to education, which is a lot more gender sensitive, we cannot cover any of the recommendations that I've just shared with you guys. With the ongoing pandemic, we know that girls are bearing the burden of the pandemic a lot more compared to boys. One of the studies recently conducted by Malala Fund estimates that about 20 million girls will not return back to school after the pandemic. So to conclude, I would just reinforce what Namla had also said, that gender sensitive budgeting and planning have to be at the heart of education reforms if we want to ensure commitment and enactment of economic justice in the true sense for adolescent girls. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Huma. I definitely agree with you regarding funding. I think we've all been asking for funding for a very long time, but it is super important to recognize that should this funding be successful in tackling some of these issues, it is also just as important to center young people, girls and adolescents, in terms of how we utilize this funding and how we move forward. It's basically two parts of the spectrum that both need to be fulfilled here, and both parts are just as equally as important. So thank you so much, Huma. Before we move on to the next session, we do have a quick time to introduce one quick question from Moira Layden, all the way from Ireland. I guess this question's for all three panelists, and I'd like to quickly hear your thoughts about what are the panelists' views on the utility of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child in addressing the multiple barriers denying girls their right to education. I think we might kick this off by starting with you, Namla. What are your thoughts?
Well, thank you for that question, an important one. I think that the convention sets the parameters quite clearly, establishes the right to education as a guarantee for girls across the world in the same way that most of our nations do in our constitutions. The issue isn't whether we've got the policy frameworks in relation to access to quality education. The issue is around whether that is being implemented and how one ensures that actual implementation happens. One of the things we've been talking about within the Action Coalition has been putting in place monitoring mechanisms that actually ensure that what it is we commit to is actually achieved. Now, a monitoring mechanism forces you to be thinking about gender disaggregated data, because at the moment, what we've got is general statistics that tell us, there's improved access to education. But when you do break that down between boys and girls, you start to see the differences, as it were. So I think one is around the monitoring of implementation, but also the monitoring of financial investments, both from public and private sectors. One of the strongest calls we're making is that both the public and private sectors need to rethink their investment decisions in education. And so I think Huma was talking about, for instance, STEM education, both in formal and informal education systems. So I would say, of course, the utility is great, but we are not seeing the implementation we should be seeing. We should be thinking a lot more about how do we increase the pressure for member states, for private sector to contribute to ensuring that access to education is equitable and fair between boys and girls, and future orientated as well.
Thank you so much, Namla. Rasha, I'm interested to hear your thoughts.
I actually, what Namla just said is the perfect answer, but I just want to say that what we lack is holding our governments accountable. From an activist perspective, is that we do have amazing policies, we do have amazing frameworks, but how are we ensuring that these are implemented and are actually reaching every girl and boy in our communities? And that's the problem, is the lack of capacity and the lack of the political will that comes with also the financing and the resources. So what I think we need to do is, as Namla said, how are we going to put monitoring practices in place and also ensure that accountability is at place. So I think that's the issue that we face, and the question goes to everyone. If anyone has an answer, I would love to hear it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rasha. That's exactly it. Keep our governments accountable. Huma, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you, Zara. I think Namla and Rasha sort of summed up what really is required for us to be able to say that we're standing by the Convention for Child Rights. One of the things that I'm going to add is that in terms of implementations, where we do see that policies and reforms are there, but they're not actually implemented in practice in different countries, especially developing countries. One of the biggest problems that comes is in terms of sensitizing the implementers. So they're not well informed in terms of what needs to be done, how it has to be executed. And then, of course, there is no monitoring and evaluation mechanisms around that to monitor whether that's happening or not happening. And also, I think there needs to be the accountability that Rasha spoke about that has to come from the grassroots level. So a lot of it can be, of course, supported by the civil society organizations, but the citizens have to come up with ways where they do hold the public officers and the government accountable if they're not implementing what is there.
Thank you so much, Huma. And I'd now like to thank all three panelists today for their incredible and very motivating words. I know that I definitely jotted down a couple of notes there, and I'm super excited and fired up to continue the fight for economic justice and rights. I'd just like to call upon the chat function where Namla has raised a question to the audience. Please feel free to answer the question. And the question is, if there was one thing the Action Coalition on Economic Justice and Rights could call for, what should it be to address education for adolescent girls? We'd love to hear your thoughts, so please continue answering the question as we move through within the day. Once again, thank you so much, Namla, Rasha, and Huma, for your incredible words. And yours in freedom, yours in power. We are so excited to continue the fight. Thank you so much. Now, moving on to the second session, gender-based violence. Now, I'm sure we can all agree that COVID-19 definitely unveiled and also exacerbated the statistics for gender-based violence. We definitely have a long way to go to build back better. But what can we do to build back better? I'm so excited to introduce Action Coalition leader, Gabrielle Henderson, technical lead of the AC on gender-based violence, to commence an update on the draft of the Action Coalition blueprint and how it has integrated the topic of education thus far. Gabrielle, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Zara, and a pleasant good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Great to hear the recommendations coming out of the previous panel as well. There are very many synergies with the Gender-Based Violence Action Coalition. So it's good to also hear your recommendations. As Zara introduced me, my name is Gabrielle Henderson, and I'm the thematic lead for the Action Coalition on Gender-Based Violence. So I'm here today to update you on where we've gotten to in terms of our blueprints and how education, particularly education of adolescent girls and young women, is addressed through these blueprints. So as with the Action Coalition on Economic Justice and Rights, we're still working through these blueprints. We have, however, landed on 4 sub-thematic areas, and these relate to creating enabling legal and policy and resource environments for addressing gender-based violence against women and girls in all their diversity, also related to the prevention of gender-based violence against women and girls in all their diversity, related to the provision of quality, affordable, essential, comprehensive services for women and girls, and also related to support to women's rights organizations to be able to use their expertise in addressing gender-based violence. So these are the 4 thematic areas, and we see that education is a key component in almost every one of these sub-thematic areas. For example, the first sub-thematic area, which relates to the adoption, implementation of laws and policies, including ratification of certain international conventions, we see that the implementation of these conventions and laws and policies should also include legal literacy for young women and adolescent girls. So girls and young women are aware of their rights within these conventions and within the laws that are adopted and implemented. That's one dimension. In terms of the sub-theme on prevention, we also see a very strong focus on education here. Education in terms of social and gender norms change, which we know is critical and should be addressed not only with women and girls, but with men and boys as well, engaging men and boys in this process of social norm change. Also, too, we see a critical focus in this sub-theme on working with the education sector so that we're addressing gender-based violence in schools specifically. And that's not only through doing the education work in schools, but also education reform, which brings a greater focus on the issue of gender-based violence against women and girls. against girls in particular, sorry. And this includes also a focus on the importance of comprehensive sexuality education for girls and boys in school. In terms of their focus on service provision as well, here again, we see the significance of adolescent girls and young women in particular understanding and being aware of their rights to essential services and the availability of these services. We also see education playing a significant role in terms of capacity development of service providers to address discriminatory norms that will impact impunity and which may cause further victimization of women and girls who are survivors of violence. So these are some of the key areas in the blueprint thus far in which we see this intersection with education and the importance of the focus on education for adolescent girls and young women in all their diversity. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabrielle. And I think we definitely saw that education definitely fits across all those 4 priorities. So it is truly important to recognize the power that education has upon creating that intergenerational reform that we are after. I now call upon young activist Fatu Sanawatu Mansari, a Sierra Leonean living who challenged world leaders and local governments to invest in education for all. I'd like to ask you, Fatu, to react and share in your own experience the priorities and initiatives that have proven to work to address these priorities.
Thank you very much, Zaya. Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to everybody. And thank you very much for having me here today. It's such an honor to join you to discuss this very important issue that affects so many girls around the world. As we all know, education is the key to everything. Without education, I would not have been here today with you all. I would not be able to join this event. Education is the right of every child, yet every day, young girls like myself face tremendous challenges just to access education. SGBV is a violation of basic human rights as girls. We all have the right to education and the right to be safe in the process of getting education. We have the right to be safe from physical and emotional abuse in and out of schools. All around the world, millions of girls experience gender-based violence, including sexual, physical, or psychosocial violence in and around school. This affects us as young girls emotionally and mentally, and it also weakens the confidence and makes us unable to learn, lead, decide, and thrive. When girls like myself face violence in and around school, it affects our health and well-being, and it makes it difficult for us to get education and achieve the goals we want to achieve. And it can also lead for us to drop out of school completely. So as you introduced me, I am a member of the GPE Youth Leaders Group, and I'm also part of Transform Education, which is hosted by Ongai, and I am a youth ambassador with Plan International. So this has given me a lot of opportunity to interact with young people, especially in West and Central Africa. So when I had an email to join this call, I went back to them and say, young people, I'm representing you in this forum. What do you want us to talk about? What experience do you want us to give to world leaders? In as much as I can sit in my room and bring out all the points, but I want you all to be inclusive. So we came together and put some things together. And one of the first and most important thing I think we talk about is how schools should provide children with safe space to learn and develop our skills that we need to succeed. We need schools to provide us safe space where we can go into, have the rights and have the freedom to learn, lead, decide, and thrive. We need schools and governments to eliminate harmful gender norms in our classrooms. For example, all through my primary school and secondary school, I never had a female teacher, which impacted me so badly. Female teachers are a role model for girls. They also play an important role in making schools safe for girls, giving them confidence and showing us what is possible. If I go to school and my math teacher is a female, then I'll look up to her as a role model and see me becoming a math teacher. But when you go to most of the schools, you don't see teachers who teach mathematics, chemistry, or biology. Most times you see them in the school clinic or you see them in the school canteen, which has impacted us as young girls so wrongly that we can't be mathematics teachers, we can't be chemistry teachers, but we need to be people who sell in the school canteens and people who stay in the school clinic. Schools also need to have comprehensive approach to gender-based violence. Teachers need training so that they can help to prevent gender-based violence and respond properly when it occurs. Because you and I, everybody present in this call, know most of us young girls who has experienced gender-based violence in schools, we need a lot time to pick up, to come back to normal, because this will affect us mentally. We need time, we need space, we need to have confidence again in the school system before we pick up. We need a system that properly deals with gender-based violence in school. We need everybody to join hands and work together, from governments, NGOs, world leaders, and everybody. Partners must also be involved. When I mean partners, it's not just NGOs who give money. I mean the community leaders. We can take this to grassroots. I mean teachers in school, even the students in the school, the young girls can be partners in seeing change. We have to make school safe for girls so that we feel confident to learn, lead, decide, and thrive. Government and schools should implement sex education into our school system, put more emphasis on the importance of sex education. I come from a very traditional home. Nobody taught me about sex when I was home, neither in my schools. I came to know about sex with my friends. So just imagine if I was that young girl who is weak and had no self-esteem, then I would have just done what my friends said. But if it has come from a teacher in my classroom, then I would have taken its importance, because we all look up to our teachers and expect them. And what we think as young people, our school should be safe to learn, not a war zone to suffer just because we are young girls. We want a world where every young girl is safe to go to school so we can learn, lead, decide, and thrive. Every other day, young girls suffer SGBV in and out of schools. And this is affecting us emotionally and physically. It reduces our capacity of becoming leaders in our society. It reduces our capacity of having self-esteem and believing in what we want. So I'm here today asking world leaders, as I have always done, to fund education, put more money in education so we can see how young girls will be safe in and out of school. Thank you very much, Zara, and thank you everybody for having me here today.
Thank you so much, Fatu, for your amazing recommendations. I think what we've heard from you today is that education does work, but once again, it all ties back into funding, and it's all about prioritizing funding to pave the way to create the changes that young people are asking for. Thank you so much once again, Fatu. I'd now like to call upon education expert Sujata Bordoloy, coordinator of UNGEI. I'd like to ask you, Sujata, to react to the potential solutions identified by the speakers and outline how the GEF can respond to these challenges.
Thank you, Zara. And wow, what an amazing set of recommendations that Fatu made. I'm inspired, and I'm truly feeling privileged to be here sharing this space with such dynamic young activists and experts. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Namaste, everyone. My name is Sujata, as Zara introduced me, and I work at the United Nations Girls Education Initiative, where I coordinate a working group on school-related gender-based violence. This seems to me like a perfect moment for us to shape actions that can have a lasting impact on the lives of girls and young women. And I really want to acknowledge and echo once again what Zara, Fatu, and others have said. It is time to listen to young people, especially when it comes to experiences of violence and abuse. I'm also very encouraged by Gabrielle's summary of the blueprint and the integration of education in it. But before we can start to deliberate on solutions and pathways to end violence, it is important to acknowledge that violence, whether it is in the form of emotional, verbal, physical abuse, or sexual harassment and violence must no longer be part of life, normalized and allowed to remain hidden. It is preventable, and for that we must speak up and refuse to accept it. Now more than ever, we are in an environment where we must uplift norms and values that work for everyone and challenge discrimination and violence in all its forms. As I've been asked to do in this panel, to put things in perspective, I want to highlight a few data points on violence in and around schools, acknowledging that data on violence in schools is not systematically collected. Number one in 3 students has been bullied by their peers at school at least once in the last month. Number 2, between 20 to 37% of students aged 11 to 17 years old experience bullying, physical, emotional, and/or sexual violence in the past year. Girls are more likely to experience psychological bullying, sexual violence, and harassment, and girls with disabilities are up to 3 times at greater risk of rape. There is just not enough data that is collected on violence against LGBTQI children at school. There is also not enough data collected about violence perpetrated based on poverty, social status, race, religion, and ethnicity, and the extent to which that affects girls and young women. This is also because children and young people just do not feel comfortable reporting incidents of violence or do not have mechanisms where they can safely report. We know that harmful sexual and gender norms within the community influences attitudes and behaviors at school. And as much as schools are protective, schools can also be sites of gender-based violence. Practices like corporal punishment, verbal and physical abuse, sexual harassment from teachers and peers is commonplace, even though these are banned by law in several countries. As speakers before me have said, education is a fundamental right and learning is a critical outcome. But we know that, and data tells us that when schools are safe and nurturing, learning outcomes are better for both boys and girls, and these gains are much more profound for girls. There is the case for education as an important lever. Schools provide opportunities to actively promote a culture of respect, nonviolence, and gender equality. Education can shift behaviors to be more equitable within the classroom, with peers, and by extension at home. And this has the potential to halt the intergenerational cycle of violence. Over the past year, we have seen that COVID-19 has taken a big toll on girls' education. As speakers before me have said, domestic violence, other forms of gender-based violence have exacerbated risks of child and early marriage, pregnancy, and child labor have reversed gains made in access and participation of girls and young women in school. It is critical, therefore, that we prepare schools to be safe havens as they open. Establish appropriate mechanisms for violence to be reported and referred, and make available counseling and psychosocial support services for students and teachers. Aligned with the blueprint action areas that Gabrielle mentioned earlier, I want to highlight 4 ways that we can harness the potential of education to shift harmful gender norms and prevent gender-based violence. Number 1, we need to develop and implement legislative reforms, normative policies, and national action plans on GBV in partnership with ministries of education and other relevant ministries. When we have a formal link between education, justice, health, and child protection agencies, we enable a better coordination and multi-sectoral response and support services for survivors of violence and sanctions for perpetrators. Number 2, prepare education systems with policies and practices to prevent and respond to gender-based violence. We call for greater investment in whole school approaches that are integrated in education plans and budgets, work across the school system and with communities to shift harmful norms. Examples of good practice from sub-Saharan Africa shows that strengthening school leadership and curricula, which equip teachers, students, and education support staff with the skills and tools to lead discussions on gender and power and challenge harmful norms, sexual and reproductive health, and techniques for positive discipline, promotes a safe learning environment. Codes of conduct for teachers and education staff and safe and confidential reporting and referral mechanisms increases the reporting of violence in schools. Number 3, invest in evidence of what works and better data on the nature and prevalence of school-related gender-based violence. We are calling for generating evidence of programmatic interventions developed and implemented by practitioners and academic institutions based in low and middle income countries. We need to provide opportunities for knowledge exchanges between countries to learn from each other on best practices. And we need to prioritize age and sex disaggregated data collection on all forms of gender-based violence in schools, which is beyond bullying and peer-to-peer violence. We need to also include schools as sites for multi-country studies on gender norms and gender-based violence. Lastly, number 4, but the most important, we call for youth leadership and active engagement of youth activists, youth networks, and girl-led organizations in the development, implementation, and review of initiatives to end school-related gender-based violence. Children and young people's voices and lived experiences of violence must be front and center in dialogues on shifting power dynamics and the culture of violence. Good practice to end violence against women and girls can be adapted, such as uplifting girls and boys clubs, empowering student councils, and working with boys and men as allies and champions. We also, lastly, need to recognize and acknowledge the role of parents and community members, religious and faith-based leaders, women's organizations, and youth networks who play a critical role in shifting norms within their communities and championing an enabling environment for girls' education and ending gender-based violence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sujata. And I'd like to quickly touch on a point that you raised earlier at your intervention. I think we all know that the statistics for the broader domestic violence statistics are already there, but you mentioned intersectionality and the statistics that are lacking for young intersectional constituencies within domestic violence and the statistics that are associated with domestic violence. We need more statistics for young people from religious backgrounds, young people from LGBTQI backgrounds, about what they are experiencing within domestic violence. And there is obviously that education gap. So thank you so much, Sujata. I definitely loved your intervention, and I cannot wait to see what we have written up within our communique. Before we do head on to the next session, I'd like to call upon a quick question that was provided by Brianna from the Irish Consortium on GBV. This question is for all panelists, but I think I'll start off with Gabrielle. What are the core challenges in addressing GBV within your context? What are some innovative ways for addressing violence against girls and women within education? Gabrielle, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you to the panelists and for those recommendations that I think will help to inform the commitments of the Action Coalition. Innovative ways for addressing education around gender-based violence for adolescent girls. What's coming through in some of the input from our youth leaders, because we do have youth leaders on our Action Coalition as well, is that we need to be using the technology. We need to be using the spaces that young women and girls are coming together in to be addressing gender-based violence. So we need to be doing this through gaming. We need to be doing it through different social media platforms. And this is one of the critical recommendations that we have coming through from our youth leaders on how we can innovatively address and have education around gender-based violence, but also that we need to be working intergenerationally at the level of communities so that we continue to have this exchange and we continue to have a whole of community approach that includes young women and girls and men and boys in addressing GBV. So I'll stop there, Zara.
Thank you so much, Gabrielle. Sujata, what about you?
Zara, could you repeat what you'd like me to respond to?
Yeah, absolutely. So the question was around what are some innovative ways of intertwining education in addressing GBV against girls and women?
There are several good examples that we have from Sub-Saharan Africa, from Brazil, which are a combination of establishing mechanisms within the school. For example, strengthening school leadership and working with teachers to challenge and shift some of those norms around violence within the school. And also at the same time, working with young people through school clubs or student councils or out of school discussions, which enable them to discuss gender and power dynamics within their own communities, within their homes, and within the school. And that discussion can be brought into the school, where they can have those discussions with their peers, and as well as taking it back to the community. So I would say that it's a combination of having those mechanisms in school which allow them to report violence when they see it, and for their teachers to be aware that if a boy is calling a girl a certain name, that's not acceptable. That's not how boys are, and that we need to shift some of those behaviors. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sujata. I might quickly touch to you, Fatu. What about you? What do you think the youth lens to this is?
Okay, thank you very much, Zaya. The first innovative thing I think we should all do is to accept the reality that young girls are suffering from SGBV, and it is affecting us mentally and emotionally. I think we should take the advocacy into the grassroots, because most of these things are happening in the communities. We need to empower the communities and see how we can work together as partners, not just bring a proposal to say to them, we want to do this. Let's all just sit on the table and say, this is what we want to do. This is what is going to work for our context. Because if you come to Sierra Leone, maybe what's going to work in Sierra Leone might be different from what's going to work in America. So let's just sit down and say, A, B, C, and Z can work for America. A, B, C, and Z can work for Sierra Leone. So if they don't put effort in it, we'll come back to them and say, we were all on the table and you told us that this was going to work. And secondly, I think we should change the way we portray women in our schools, in our classrooms, and our textbooks. For Sierra Leone, all through my primary and secondary school, I had not come across a mathematics textbook that have a female. All the textbooks you see are male, and you go into our chemistry books, our biology books, everything you see is about men. So I think editing things like this and facing reality and knowing that this is what it is and this is what it's going to work. Let's just focus and see how we can change the gender stereotypes in our communities, in our textbooks, in our novels, even the novels we read, in our movies. Let's change how we portray women on movies. Most of the movies you watch, you see women fighting for love, women taking care of children, and the man, maybe he's a lawyer, a doctor, and he's the one who is supporting the family. I think the key innovative way we should change how we portray women in everything we do.
Thank you so much, Fatu. I definitely share your sentiments. Grassroots advocacy is the key towards creating that change that young people are after. And it is so important to listen to advocates that are at the grassroots to implement the changes that we are constantly asking for. Once again, I'd love to thank our speakers today, Gabrielle Henderson, Fatu Sawanatu Mansari, and Sujata Bardaloy, for your incredible insights on the session Gender-Based Violence. We are so appreciative of your knowledge, and we cannot wait to see what's next in our fight against gender-based violence. Thank you so much, and let's move on to the third and final session of the day. I'd just like to remind all the audience members that if you have any comments, please feel free to leave your comments and questions within the chat box. We'd love to call upon your questions, and we are super excited to hear your insights as well. So please feel free to actively use this feature. Now, moving on to the final session, I'm so excited to introduce three incredible speakers today to discuss the third dialogue, Feminist Action for Climate Justice. Once again, please ask any questions to the speakers that you have. If you have anything, please leave it below and we will hopefully get back to you during the question and answer. But to begin, I'd like to call upon co-leader of the Action Coalition, Bridget Burns, Director of We Do, to provide a overview of the draft of the Action Coalition Blueprint and how it has integrated the topic of education thus far. Bridget, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Zara, and good morning, good evening, afternoon, folks. It's a real pleasure to be here. As said, my name is Bridget Burns. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the director of the Women's Environment and Development Organization, also known as We Do. And I'm calling in today from the unceded Lenape territory, or so-called Brooklyn. And it's a real privilege to be discussing the issue of climate justice and what feminist action for climate justice looks like. So it's been, in listening to all of the other action coalitions, I've been struck by how so much of the reality, and this is really why those of us who work at this intersection of gender equality, environment, climate justice, have always understood climate change, very similar to COVID, as being a great exacerbator, not a great equalizer in terms of its impacts, but an exacerbator of the inequalities that exist around the world based on multiple forms of oppressions and intersections, including gender. And in terms of the solutions that we need to solve this crisis, just how incapable we will be able to do that unless we center equality and human rights in what those solutions look like. Because, just as women and girls in all their diversity, including and in particular grassroots and Indigenous women, are at the front lines of crisis when it comes to not only the impacts of climate change, but often the solutions that are put forward that drive people off of their land, that take away their voice and rights. We see women and girls at the front lines of those fights and putting themselves at risk in many different ways. And we also see many different solutions that are being led in a very gender just manner that are not getting the attention and the resources and being scaled and replicated in the way that we know that they should. So we're really thrilled, the co-leads of this action coalition, to think through how do we create a transformative agenda over the next 5 years that can serve as a blueprint, not just for governments, but really a multi-sectoral blueprint that movements can look to, that private sector and those working in shifting financial flows can look to, that UN agencies can look to think about what does it mean to create that enabling environment for climate justice. And we, like many other action coalitions, are still in that process of consultation and honing in what these look like. These are big questions that we're asking, and we want to get it right. We want to get the targets and the actions correct in terms of what's going to provide that real transformative impact and going to get to the root causes of some of these challenges. And we have also started to hone in around 4 different sub-themes, which I'm going to try to explain as concisely as possible to pass on to my other colleagues to share. The first one is centered around finance. And I like to look at this as both, in the broad scale of what we call climate finance. So there's money that flows through multilateral dedicated funds like the Green Climate Fund, some of you might have heard of, and other climate finance mechanisms. And unfortunately, a lot of these mechanisms, although they do have often policies to take into account gender equality, the rights of Indigenous peoples, they're still not exactly fit for purpose in terms of ensuring direct access to women's groups, to feminist organizations on the ground. So how do we make those mechanisms more fit for purpose? But then beyond that, how do we generate more resources to provide direct access and direct channels for financing for gender just climate solutions, for lifting up the work that grassroots and Indigenous organizations and communities are leading around the world, and have them really be the defining solution for climate action. But beyond this sort of framing of how do we make the finance that's available more accessible, and how do we put women and girls at the decision-making table for how to use and how to channel those flows, we have this overarching problem that there's not enough climate finance in general. So we've had estimates that we need money in the trillions in terms of actually being able to shift, adapt, mitigate to the climate challenge. And the Green Climate Fund, as an example, has only ever had pledges up to the amount of $10 billion. So we need the trillions, and we're still fighting in the billions. And so we need to do more to shift financial flows. And so part of this is what I think is resonating across all the action coalitions. How do we divest from harm? And harm could be defined in many ways. I know for We Do as an organization, harm includes investment in fossil fuels and the extractive industry. Harm includes military investment. Harm can include investments in the carceral state. So how do we make changes in terms of how we invest in harm to be able to invest in care? And I think a lot of our colleagues in the Economic Justice Coalition are thinking through that, but in the Climate Justice Action Coalition, we're really thinking through, where are we seeing those shifts happening so that we can make sure we're getting at that root cause of how the money not being available is actually simply not prioritizing where we're putting our investments in people and planet. The next theme is data. And so I think this is a common challenge that we all face in many of the work that we do, is that often the data and information that we need to understand not just gender differentials, but intersectional gender differentials in terms of how people are being impacted by policies and how they're being impacted by crises. And that informs policies that get developed that are blind to different forms of oppressions. And so particularly in the area of climate and environment, we are trying to craft an action area that thinks about how do we do data collection to ensure a just transition. So there's a lot of work happening right now to create COVID recovery packages that take climate into account, that take gender into account. We see some countries putting forward ambitious plans to transform their economies to be more low carbon and climate economies. How do we make sure that we aren't re-cementing gender inequalities and other forms of inequality in that transition? And part of that is a requirement for key data, for data sets that are looking in a deeply intersectional way of what does gender look like in terms of transport, agriculture, forestry. How do we make sure from both a jobs perspective as well as from an economic perspective that we are leaving no one behind in this transition? A third area is around leadership. And I think that this is something that I'm sure cuts across the other action coalitions as well. That even though there has been direct acknowledgement in the multiple global frameworks that we have, that when women and girls in all their diversities lead on climate action, in environmental policy making, when they're included in the decision making around how to manage projects, that they are more effective, that they're more resilient, they lead to better outcomes. And yet we're still seeing their leadership and decision making not being centered in either global policy making or, more importantly, I think, on the ground in terms of leadership and design of these programs and policies. And we know that a lot needs to happen to actually transform leadership and also transform the way what we think about what is feminist leadership for sustainable development. It's a new model of leadership, right? It's a cooperative model of leadership. How do we invest in that? How do we scale that? How do we tackle discriminatory gender norms? And how do we get countries and other multi-sectoral organizations to make real commitments to be able to measure where we're seeing that leadership? And then the final area is around creating resilience. So enhancing the capacity of women and girls and all their diversity to be able to build resilience to climate and disaster risks, to mitigate climate change, to address loss and damage, to include land rights and tenure security. We know there's a whole framing of enabling environments that unless and until we build capacity, it's really difficult and challenging to be able to combat these challenges. And part of this is, like I said, how do we invest in those gender just cooperative models that we're seeing women around the world leading in terms of agroecology, fisheries? How do we scale those and replicate them? how do we invest in this? And I'm going to just quickly, and then I'll pass back, say a piece about education, because for me, education is throughout all of these pieces in terms of a re-education that's needed across the spectrum, both in terms of education for adolescent girls and adolescent youth, but also education that has to happen across different sectors on the way we think, so that we think in the forms of what are more sustainable approaches to our businesses, to our government, to our societies. But I think in this form, we have a really strong push for developing green and gender transformative learning, and including the goals and policies of gender equitable access to education. And we want to see that as central to all countries' climate plans, their just transition plans, and we want to see how that is then linked to being able to create those resilient societies that can be resilient to climate justice. And I think one of the other pieces that becomes really critical throughout all of this is when we talk about education and climate justice, it's beyond, it isn't, of course, inclusive of this idea of this just transition that I mentioned. And so there is a lot of emphasis on the need for training in terms of quote unquote green jobs to make sure that there's equitable access to those jobs and opportunities in a new low carbon society. So this is a focus on ensuring women and girls equal participation in STEM education becomes a really critical piece of this. But it's also a political advocacy education as well, because we see already women and girls around the world are leading in fights against climate change and fights against extractive industries, and they're leading marches, they're leading movements and demanding action from their countries, from their governments, and they're often doing so where they're facing threats of violence as well. So this is why this kind of systemic approach across all these action areas is critically important, because it's not enough. I think I saw one of the questions in the chat box. It's not enough to just ensure equitable access to education. We have to ensure that access to education includes access to voice and leadership and rights and justice, so that we are not letting young women and girls around the world who are raising their voices then facing threats of violence with impunity. So that becomes, I think, a critical piece when we think through what education looks like and how it both provides the skills, but also the rights and resources to tackle this challenge.
Thank you so much, Bridget. I think you totally captured just about everything there, and I truly do share your sentiments. I think it is also super important to look at the concepts of young feminists being remunerated for their time as well, because they are putting in so much effort for this. And we speak about leadership on one part, but that also extends to funding and remuneration for these leaders, especially young leaders within the movement. So thank you so much for your words. I now call upon young activist Juanita Barberia, co-leader of the Action Coalition and co-founder of Girls for Climate from Uganda, to share her thoughts and experiences about the priorities and initiatives that have proven to work to address these priorities that Bridget has previously spoken about. Juanita, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much, Bridget, for that extensive presentation. First of all, I'm Juanita Barberia from Uganda, and very honored to be part of this webinar to discuss a topic that I'm very, very interested in, and I've been working on for a couple of years right now. I would like to appreciate the work that the Feminist Action for Climate Justice Action Coalition leaders have done so far, seeing most of the themes having a diverse perspective and geographical consideration, while having most of the pertinent challenges that young women and girls face put at the forefront of this is very, very commendable. When you look at access to finance, we see that most of the organizations that are led by young women and girls have got so many obstacles to access finance, to increase their contribution to gender just solutions. In most cases, girls and young women are considered as just target groups and not partners in changing the status quo. And in cases where we are wanted as partners, we are limited by the conditions and structures that are needed to access the finances. From my ground knowledge, the idea would be that we continue building the knowledge and capacity of girls and young women, at the same time make interventions case specific. We are losing out on very great solutions that young women and girls could have in stock. That is where I agree with Bridget on education is kind of a piece that fits in all the sub-themes that we've mentioned here. I would also relate to our community. In my community, indigenous women and girls have used their indigenous knowledge to prototype solutions to most of the local climate challenges. And as Girls for Climate, a movement that is putting young women and girls at the forefront of climate action, we're engaging them in increasing new solutions to key challenges through our local climate demonstration hubs. And now the local climate demonstration hubs act as knowledge hubs for them to have the freedom to create, iterate, and test different solutions. And every other day, we are deeply amazed by the ideas coming out of these knowledge sessions. And this now shows us the power of education and the need for knowledge spaces in the various communities. I will emphasize the need for knowledge spaces in communities specifically because from our experience, most of the young women and girls in many rural communities find it very difficult to access spaces or knowledge hubs that are situated far from where they stay. Because most of the parents fear that they'll be harmed along the way, and they fear the harm that might befall their girls if they would walk long distances to access these spaces. Therefore, as we talk about education, talk about schools, talk about the knowledge hubs that we want to also put into our different themes and actions, we also need to know how do we bring these spaces closer to the girls? Because if you put them further away from them, we are also increasing the risk that there is. We have also continued to talk about creating awareness about the different actors. For instance, when you look at the themes right now and the commitments, we've talked about green investments, we've talked about polluting entities, how we can create campaigns in that regard. For example, I would relate to what is happening right now in East Africa, where they need to build a 1,443 kilometer crude oil pipeline, which is to run through Uganda and Tanzania, that is sponsored by Standard Bank. Now, it is predicted that this pipeline, if built, would be the longest heated crude oil pipeline in the world, and it's expected to cause large-scale displacements of communities and pose grave risks to protected environments, water sources, and wetlands in both Uganda and Tanzania. Now, also seeing that women and girls are more vulnerable to such impacts, we can only engage young women and girls in a campaign like this if they're already aware of why they should actually do it and have clear information on its effects. This calls for more climate education in these communities to clearly get them exposed to such information, provoke action, and see that most of these challenges that they are facing from different angles can be spoken about. We can run successful campaigns and all that is needed to run to make sure that there's climate action at the local levels. And Bridget also talked about the data and as one of the things that we are looking at as a theme. But I would also say, I would also agree very, very much that we lack this kind of data. And if the data is there, it is very inaccessible to young women that are living in rural communities. So girls and young women, I feel, should be able, basically, girls and young women in rural communities should be able to access this data, and that must use it to start action and create and define their positions to contribute to gender considerations in climate policies, climate action plans. If I would also relate to what is happening right now, where countries are revising their nationally determined contributions. But it is very, very sad that only 67 out of the 160 NDCs, that is approximately 42%, include a direct reference to children, youths, and only 8 have a consideration on intergenerational injustices and the future generations. Most of them do not have gender issues or climate education clearly defined, and was still no young women or no young woman has already been consulted in this process. So this makes it very hard for for girls in the rural communities to get engaged in such processes, to see that there is justice at the end of the day. Now, the data also goes hand in hand with creating the enabling environments that is to train more young women and girls in leadership to be able to occupy positions of power. I for one, believe that there's having the position, and another thing would be making use of the position. As girls and young women, we can only make use of the position if we have all the knowledge and capacity to be able to tackle all these gender norms that limit women and girls, contribute to decisions and plans until we see them implemented. As Girls for Climate, for the years we have worked with young women and girls in rural and indigenous communities, we have continued to see the power of education in creating resilience, contributing to mitigation and adaptation, policy changes, and local climate actions. This has been through our Girl Climate Corps fellowship, climate captains training, pushing for climate series in rural schools, and also continue to train, because we believe a generation that is having the information, that is aware of what's happening, is a generation that can't suffer injustices, because in case it appears, they will be able to stand up and advocate for their rights. So I would also conclude by saying, I believe in education and I see it cutting across in all sectors. So let's continue to invest in the education of young women and girls, especially those in rural and indigenous communities who are very vulnerable to climate change impacts and all other issues. So we need to bring education resources closer to them, not forgetting making the resources very relatable to them. It can be through art, it can be through drama, it can be through music, etc., depending on what a certain community identifies with. The exceptional knowledge they can gain in addition to their indigenous knowledge and them being key stewards of the environment, I feel that we'll be able to achieve the vision of Generation Equality Forum and also our vision as the Feminist Action for Climate Justice. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Over to Zahra.
Thank you so much, Juanita. I think you definitely raised an important point in regards to access to education, specifically targeting the constituencies that we are after. When we speak about access to education for Indigenous people, it definitely differs to access to education for other constituencies that are fortunate enough to be included within the narrative for feminist action for climate justice. So it is super important to be flexible and to cater towards those communities that have been left behind and that have been leading the movement. I'd now like to call upon education expert Lucia Fry, Director of Research and Policy from Malala Fund, to react to the potential solutions identified by the speakers and outline how the GEF can respond to the challenges. Lucia, please go ahead.
Hi there, I'm not sure if I'm on camera. I've been, can I start my video now? I'm not able to start my video because the host has stopped it. So if somebody could step in and help out with that, that'd be great. Ah, there we go, thanks. And thanks so much to the organisers for this event, to Zahra for your lovely, sensitive chairing and moderation. It's really been a pleasure to listen to you. And especially to the youth speakers. I mean, I think I feel a bit of a fraud being deemed an education expert when I listen to those youth speakers. I think really all of you are the real experts. And it's just great to hear you and to see that this dialogue is moving towards a genuine intergenerational partnership, respecting adolescent girls in all their diversity as the rights holders, but also as the activists and the leaders of the movement for feminist action for climate justice. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about Malala Fund's recent work on girls' education, gender equality, and climate justice. And I guess my proposition today is really that girls' rights to, in, and through education are critical but overlooked components to our understanding of both the climate crisis, the problem of climate change, and its solutions. So I'll kick off by saying a little bit about the problem side of it. We do know that in any crisis, a conflict, a pandemic, such as the one we're experiencing now, the most vulnerable are hit hardest, and their access to the very resources and services that could protect them or build resilience is the most precarious. And that's what we see playing out in the climate crisis. Climate shocks, as others have said, are intensifying the existing barriers and threats to girls' education, some of which have been touched on today. You know, for example, issues around domestic care, domestic work, trafficking of women and so on. Those can all be intensified by climate shocks, and those are all threats to girls' education as well. Vulnerable households, particularly those who rely on natural resources like land or fishing grounds, may resort to harmful coping strategies such as marrying off girls, and they may find that the care burdens on girls become heavier as well. So, for example, a study in Botswana found that 70% of children who dropped out of school during phases of drought were girls, and that 56% of girls reported travelling longer distances than usual to fetch water. Research from Somalia found that when families migrated from rural to urban areas as a result of flooding in 2018-19, girls' enrolment rates dropped from 45% to just 29%, whereas enrolment rates for boys actually increased after they migrated. We also know that countries facing large girls' education challenges are the same ones experiencing the most intense effects of climate change now and likely to continue to do so for the future. In a forthcoming report, which will be out in March, we'll include both an index of countries experiencing that double jeopardy of girls' education challenge and climate change, and also new projections on the number of girls likely to be pushed out of school due to climate-related events. And I suppose, you know, it's an irony that although girls' education is something that around which there's a lot of consensus and, you know, some level of self-congratulation in some global arenas, perhaps premature congratulation, it's actually an area which is likely to be, where progress is likely to be put in jeopardy by climate change. But coming to the more optimistic side, we believe that realising girls' rights to 12 years of quality education is one of the most powerful strategies in the fight against climate change, especially if we include making education climate smart, making that a key element of quality. And we see that in three main ways. One is that it can equip girls with skills and competencies needed to respond to the challenges in improving climate adaptation, mitigation and resilience. For example, a Brookings study from 2013 projected that if 70% of women aged 20 to 39 received at least a lower secondary education, it would reduce disaster-related deaths in about 130 countries by 60%. Sexual and reproductive health and rights through quality education and access to contraception is fundamental for girls' rights and for gender equality, but it could also decrease the rate and impact of global warming. So, for example, the World Bank suggests that a secondary outcome of eliminating child marriage and reducing early pregnancy could be a reduction in total emissions from fossil fuels by in the region of 40% by the end of the century. But it's not just about getting girls into classrooms, it's about what happens when they make it through the school gates. Improving quality education for girls has to include a breadth of skills, including those STEM opportunities, which Huma mentioned, but not only STEM opportunities, things like critical inquiry, collaborative learning and problem solving. Those can all can ensure that girls can contribute to and thrive in a world changed by climate change, whether that's through their economic life, in the kinds of jobs that they can take up, or in activism or in political leadership. And so that's why Malala Fund's forthcoming report will call for others, will join others in calling for a gender equal green learning agenda. And this is a new framework that we're proposing to help leaders address the climate crisis through education. It proposes education reforms to help every girl access a quality education, and that all students can acquire the knowledge, skills, and values, not only to thrive in, to exist in a world changed by climate change, but in order to challenge the social and economic inequalities that fuel the crisis. So we have a few recommendations for the Action Coalition, and I was very, very happy to hear much of this preceded, but much of my remarks preceded by what Bridget and Jonita said. We want generation equality for the Action Coalition to listen to girls, first of all. Young people, especially girls, are leading the way on climate action, whether it's the 10 million strikers who've joined Fridays for Future, or the young female activists that Malala Fund is currently supporting, who are so passionate about the climate emergency, as we've heard today. We can't keep talking about girls' future potential, and whilst simultaneously not recognising and respecting the leadership they're already providing. Girls' education should be recognised as central to gender and climate justice in the Action Coalition blueprint. Investing in girls' education and reforming education can deliver on girls' rights, as well as building a sustainable, greener and more equal future. And then finally, we need to reform education to make it transformative so that it is oriented towards gender and climate justice. So that means creating an expanded vision of green skills and STEM education. It also means promoting sustainable values and behaviours, and finally fostering climate activism. I think growing that generation that Jonita mentioned, that understands and will stand up for their rights when they've had an empowering and radical climate education. So we'd like this to be a top global priority, as I'm sure many of you would. Our dream is that within 5 years of the blueprint being agreed, we'd like milestones in climate change learning strategies and a maintained commitment to gender transformative climate education as a collaboration between UN Women, the global education community, and UNFCCC. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucia, and especially thank you so much for wrapping up that incredible session. We've heard so many important messages throughout this dialogue, including prioritising young people, prioritising Indigenous voices, emphasising their voices. It's no longer just about recognising that young people are powerful. It's just also about ensuring that we do extend that arm to support young people to create the changes that they are after. Thank you so much, Bridget, Juanita, and Lucia, for your incredible statements within this dialogue. I'm sure the audience has definitely taken away some amazing messages, and we are super excited to include your advice within our future communiques that we will develop. Unfortunately, we are very short on time, so I may have to transition to a quick video that GPE has provided. We've spoken today about how girls' education and strong partnerships are crucial to advancing gender equality in and through education. This cannot be done without sustained investment in education. So GPE has launched a financing campaign to raise at least $5 billion, calling on world leaders to raise their hands in support of education and keep education financing as a top priority. We'd now like to share a short video on why we all need to raise our hands for education.
When she raised her hand, it was to reach the highest point. When she raised her hand, it was to touch the stars, to give us a reason to dream. When he raised his hand, it was to stand up for his rights, to start over, to learn against all odds. When she raises her hand, it's to answer yes, to seize her future. Every change starts with a powerful act. Raise your hand. Fund education.
Thank you so much for that wonderful video, GPE. I now call upon CEO of the Global Partnership for Education, Alice Albright, to share a couple of words in concluding this dialogue.
Thank you so much, Zara. Let me just do a quick sound check and make sure that everybody can hear me okay. Okay, I'm seeing nods, and so I'm assuming that's a yes. Thank you, Zara. Let me start by thanking the Irish government, the French government, and UN Women for hosting this very important event, along with our partners at UNESCO, the Malala Fund, and Plan International. I want to extend my greetings to Ambassador Nason of Ireland, our dear friend Ambassador Delphine O, who of course is the Secretary General of the Forum, government representatives from the Action Coalitions, and our wonderful young activists and experts. The inspiration, expertise, and commitment we've heard over the two webinars gives me real hope. Translating that hope into transformational action is what I want to talk to you about today. The world is changing fast, but I think the question is it changing fast enough for girls? The pandemic has shown us, in fact, how rapidly the world can change, and it is already changing at lightning speed, had been changing at lightning speed before COVID-19. But for millions of girls around the world, positive change hasn't come fast enough. 20 million will not return to school even after the worst of the pandemic is behind us. And 130 million were out of school even before the pandemic. Our efforts towards generation equality should center on these girls. For so many, the digital divide meant that they couldn't access educational resources during the pandemic. Gender-based violence increased, as did early pregnancies. And we're likely to see 13 million more girls into early childhood marriages owing to the pandemic. Let's let that number sink in for a moment. 13 million more girls into early marriages owing to the pandemic. So we need a greater, more transformative push at scale. 25 years after the Beijing conference, we still have a long way to go to reach gender equality. We need more than a call for change. What we need is a monumental shift, a transformative push at scale, bolstered by an unprecedented show of global will to make sure that this generation of girls and boys are placed on a path towards equality. Compelling evidence presented over the 2 days shows that girls' education is the starting point of this transformative shift. But we need to refocus the lens that we use to look at girls' education to harness the full potential of education. We can no longer take a siloed view of girls' education, a view that ignores the gendered social norms, structural, institutional, and policy frameworks in which girls live their lives. If we want girls to have agency and autonomy, true representation in government, social and economic justice, and be prepared for the careers in the 21st century economy, which includes STEM, we have to transform their ecosystems along with delivering a quality education. In fact, this is what the Gender Equality Forum is an important opportunity to do exactly that. We see 3 pillars for change. It is clear that we need to address the persistent and structural barriers to girls' education by doubling down on critical solutions. This means guaranteeing 12 years of quality and safe education for girls. It means improving teacher training on gender-sensitive methods and content. It means providing sanitation and hygiene facilities, and it means preventing school-related gender-based violence and providing comprehensive sexuality education and improving the skills and technical training for girls. With 12 years of a quality education for every girl, we can boost economies by as much as $30 trillion, reduce maternal deaths by 2/3, and cut infant mortality in half. So what are the 3 pillars? 1, we need to enable entire education systems to respond to the gendered needs and experiences of all children, particularly girls. 2, we must be owned. Change must be owned and driven by countries and supported with firm and ambitious international resolve. And 3, we need to increase the financing for education across the board because we can't afford to leave any child behind. Gender equality is central to GPE's vision and work. GPE's financing conference in July, which will be co-hosted by the UK and Kenya, will be one of the key events in the calendar this year. There, we will seek to raise at least $5 billion for education, and it will include a new gender financing window, which will help provide additional incentives and scope to countries to address the gender priorities that they have. So let's make 2021 the year of girls' education. We have a real opportunity to drive change through the G7 summit, through the GPE financing conference, and culminating in crucial commitments at the Gender Equality Forum. All around the world, girls are living and learning in the most difficult circumstances. So our efforts need to redouble and help them out. Let's ensure that girls' education is a core part of the commitments for all the Action Coalition. So I'd like to introduce you to a song. This will be a treat. We all know that music and arts help bring issues into the public consciousness and provide impetus for change. So I'm proud to introduce to you an original song written for GPE's financing campaign. It will be dedicated to the hundreds of millions of girls that are not only denied an opportunity to learn, but the opportunity for hope. The song will be performed by Gemma Hayes, who many of you know is the winner of 2 of Ireland's Best Female Artists Award. She's also been a nominee for the Mercury Prize. And the final track will be officially released on International Women's Day, so just in about a couple weeks, with a host of famous artists to create a drumbeat of attention and action. I hope that you will enjoy this powerful ode to education. So my colleagues who are in charge of the logistics will now play you the song. And I'd like to thank you so much for inviting me. I very much look forward to working with all of you in the Gender Equality Forum. So thank you.
This room is a safe place. This room is a home. Some girls get to learn here about lives they've never known. What we take for granted, far too many won't. So we're banging on a drum, throwing out a lifeline of hope. Raise her up, raise. Teach her the way, the power to say, I am here, I am here, I am here. Raise her up, raise. Let her be heard, shout to the world, I am here, I am here, I am here. Raise her up, raise. Teach her the way, the power to say, I am here, I am here, I am here. Raise her up, raise. Let her be heard, shout to the world, I am here, I am here, I am here. Raise her up, raise. Let her be heard, shout to the world, I am here, I am here, I am here. Raise her up, raise. Let her be heard, shout to the world, I am here, I am here, I am here. Who gets to decide? Who gets to keep their power? Why didn't I have the right in making this world better? She has wings, so give her a reason why. Teach her how to unfold them and teach her how to fly. Raise her up, raise. Teach her the way, the power to say, I am here, I am here, I am here. Raise her up, raise. Give her a voice, the beauty of choice. I am here, I am here, I am here, I am. Now that I am older and looking at my daughter, wanting so much better for a life that she should author, for the right, for what's right for her, feed the fire that's within her. Raise her up, raise. Teach her the way, the power to say, I am here, I am here, I am here. Raise her up, raise. Let her be heard, shout to the world, I am here, I am here, I am here. I am here, I am.
Thank you so much, Alice, and thank you so much for that amazing song. I have goosebumps. I'm very much so speechless right now. So it's such a beautiful way to end my night, at least. I now have the privilege of introducing our final speaker for the day, Ambassador Delphine O. Delphine, the floor is yours.
Merci beaucoup. Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Donc, je vais m'exprimer en français. Je m'étais déjà exprimée lors de l'ouverture du premier webinaire qui a eu lieu la semaine dernière et je suis vraiment ravie que toutes et tous aient pu participer à ces deux webinaires. Je pense que tous les témoignages des jeunes adolescentes et des jeunes femmes qui se sont exprimées la semaine dernière et cette semaine, ainsi que ceux des experts, nous seront vraiment précieux dans le cadre de ce forum Génération Égalité sur lequel les discussions ont porté pendant ces deux journées pour déterminer des engagements forts de toute la communauté internationale, évidemment des États, mais aussi de l'ONU, des Nations Unies, des organisations multilatérales, de la société civile, des partenaires privés, dans le cadre de nos 6 coalitions d'action. Tous nos partenaires, que ce soit l'UNESCO, UNGAI, l'UNICEF, Plan International, le Malala Fund, les pays qui sont ici présents, les représentants du secteur privé, sont des moteurs essentiels pour faire avancer la cause de l'égalité et entraîner avec eux tout le reste de la communauté internationale. Je salue particulièrement, comme je l'avais fait lors de l'introduction du premier webinaire la semaine dernière, le travail de l'UNESCO avec son rapport annuel sur l'égalité de genre dans l'éducation, ses travaux statistiques et ses nombreuses publications qui nous permettent de suivre l'état d'avancement de la question de l'éducation des filles et des adolescentes chaque année dans le monde. L'UNESCO, nous le savons tous, s'est extrêmement mobilisé dans le cadre de la pandémie de la Covid-19 pour faciliter les échanges, accélérer les partenariats entre les différents acteurs pour trouver des solutions rapides à ce problème extrême de la déscolarisation des filles et des adolescentes due à la pandémie. La Gender Flagship Initiative, qui a été mise en place au sein de la coalition, entreprend notamment un travail de recherche approfondi sur les conséquences justement de la fermeture des écoles sur les filles. Dans le cadre du Forum Génération Égalité, vous le savez, nous avons 6 coalitions d'action et la France est championne d'une des coalitions d'action, la coalition sur les droits et santé sexuelle et reproductive et la liberté de disposer de son corps, aux côtés notamment de l'Argentine, du Burkina Faso, du Danemark et de la Macédoine du Nord. Dans le cadre de cette coalition, nous sommes vraiment particulièrement mobilisés pour que les engagements spécifiques à cette coalition soient à la hauteur des enjeux. Et je pense à un sujet qui a été abordé par Madame Albright, l'éducation complète à la sexualité. Pour la France, c'est un domaine d'intervention prioritaire pour la coalition, pour permettre de donner à toutes les jeunes filles, mais aussi aux jeunes hommes, aux jeunes garçons, scolarisés et non scolarisés, toutes les informations nécessaires pour prendre des décisions sur leur corps et sur leur santé. L'éducation complète à la sexualité est un outil vertueux qui permet de lutter, non seulement d'éduquer les garçons et les filles, mais aussi de lutter contre toutes les formes de violence et de discrimination, de réduire les inégalités entre filles et garçons et de donner une meilleure chance pour choisir son avenir. Enfin, je voudrais remercier Madame Alice Albright, Dear Alice, pour son intervention. Vous le savez, la France est très fortement engagée auprès du Partenariat mondial pour l'éducation. Nous avons renouvelé notre contribution à Dakar en 2018 pour 200 millions d'euros et nous continuerons à le soutenir, notamment dans la perspective de la conférence de reconstitution du Partenariat mondial pour l'éducation qui, vous l'avez dit, aura lieu fin juillet à Londres. Nous saluons évidemment la prise en compte renforcée du genre et de l'égalité filles-garçons transversale dans toutes les politiques et dans la stratégie quinquennale du Partenariat mondial pour l'éducation, ainsi que la mise en place d'une enveloppe dédiée à l'égalité dans l'éducation des filles. Nous encourageons évidemment le Partenariat mondial pour l'éducation à s'investir dans le cadre du Forum Génération Égalité à nos côtés pour développer nos engagements communs en faveur de l'égalité de genre, pour davantage orienter des financements qui vont vers l'éducation des filles et faire le lien avec la conférence qui aura lieu à Londres fin juillet. Toutes les recommandations qui ont été émises pendant ces 2 webinaires, et je remercie encore nos partenaires dans l'organisation de ces webinaires, seront compilées dans une feuille de route commune que nous allons valoriser dans les prochains mois, dans la perspective du forum qui aura lieu, vous le savez, à Mexico de façon virtuelle du 29 au 31 mars, puis à Paris au mois de juin. Et nous saluons également les recommandations du groupe de travail mondial sur l'éducation qui ont été évoquées pendant ces webinaires. Nous sommes donc ravis et nous attendons avec impatience de pouvoir recevoir tout le monde virtuellement à Mexico et à Paris en mars et en juin pour le Forum Génération Égalité. Je ne doute pas que de très nombreux événements seront consacrés à l'éducation et pourront s'inspirer de ces 2 webinaires. Je vous remercie.
Thank you so much, Ambassador O, for your amazing words, and thank you so much for ending off today's dialogue with a brief overview about the next steps that will happen. I now invite our graphic harvester, Hazel, to share the outcome of the second dialogue.
Thank you, Zara. So the first theme was economic justice and rights. And we learned about how education is related to so many different issues. And we can see that governments rely on women to provide care services. And there's unfair labor that's carried out by girls. And we need a cultural shift to address this. And really, education is at the heart of everything. And we need education in order to reduce employment. We need to increase training and education and an opportunity for decent work. 12 years of education, 12 years of access to education would be the ideal. And we need to see STEM teachers for girls at all levels, and ideally some women teachers in this role as well. So that was some of the key takeaways from economic justice and rights. Also the issue of modern slavery and the intersectionality of all these issues with education. Now, and moving on to gender-based violence. So again, yeah, education linking to various issues. The need for literacy for girls to understand their rights, so they can read, documents, and the need to change gender norms by working with men and boys also. Gender-based violence can lead to low confidence, low self-esteem, and also it takes time to recover, which can, set back girls' development. We need to create a safe space, not a war zone. And this can lead to better learning outcomes. We need to see female role models, especially in STEM subjects and in the textbooks and resources we use. We need to see pictures and stories of women in these positions. We need to be able to speak out and say this is not acceptable, but there needs to be mechanisms in place to respond. So this is all part of the safe space. And policies and laws need to be in place, supported by statistics and data to address the issue of gender-based violence. And then the final topic was feminist action for climate justice. And here we heard that climate change is the great exacerbator. And we focused on finance and how there needs to be direct channels, divesting finance from harm and into care. And also there's just not enough finance, there needs to be more. And then some case study from Uganda, where we saw the climate hub, making sure it's close to girls for their safety and the kind of climate challenges that exist in that country, in that region, such as a proposed pipeline and the fact that education is so important to mitigate any kind of negative impacts on livelihoods for the people there. Leadership at all levels, and we need to listen to girls, and resilience is very important. Again, we focused on the need for data, and it needs to be intersectional and accessible. And also we touched on including gender in the NDCs of countries. Again, 12 years of quality education and a breadth of skills to help girls overcome climate change and the different challenges it poses. So feminist action for climate justice should be a top global priority. So those are some of the key takeaways from the day. This will be available on social media and it will be translated into French and Spanish as well, and it'll be available for you. So thank you, Zara, back to you.
Thank you so much, Hazel, and I can definitely speak on behalf of the entire audience that is absolutely phenomenal, and we cannot wait to see that and have a copy ourselves. We have come to an end of this dialogue today, and I want to thank all the participants for coming. I'd also like to extend my gratitude to all the panelists and the guest speakers who were able to share their insights today. The knowledge that was shared within this virtual space was absolutely incredible, and I'm sure we've all walked away with something new or some piece of information that we haven't quite gathered before. Just in terms of what is next, there will be a youth manifesto that will be created and will be gathered, provided by the recommendations that were given today and within the session that was held on the 11th of February to address adolescent girls' education in the Generation Equality Action Coalition. The outcome document will then be shared to all registrants, uploaded on the GEF website, and more largely disseminated. It will be presented during the Mexico Forum starting on March 29th, and it will inform the draft blueprints that are being developed by the action coalitions. Just a reminder, if you want to stay involved within the Generation Equality Forum and the Generation Equality processes, and you would like to contribute to the action coalitions, you can stay tuned at the GEF website and for more announcements and events. You can also contribute to the public conversation online platform dedicated to mobilizing the public around critical issues of equity and justice within their communities and providing ideas for a catalogue commitments for all leaders of the action coalitions. Once again, thank you so much to everyone who participated today. We hope to see you in more virtual spaces soon. Have a lovely night, day, morning, etc., everyone. See ya.
Thank you.